Ladies and gentlemen, our next speaker is Professor Robert Home, Emeritus Professor of Land and Management. Professor Home was a principal lecturer and reader in planning at University of East London and also lecturer in the Department of Land Management and Development at the University of Reading. He also held visiting positions at the University on Nanting Space, University of Stellenbosch, and University of Pretoria in South Africa, Obafemi Awolowo University, Ife, Nigeria, Cobalt University in Zambia, IFA, Kyoto, Japan, and Hong Kong. His research interests combine history, law, and urban planning, both in the UK and developing countries. Professor Home has supervised over 22 doctoral students to completion on various dissertations ranging from land reform in Kenya, land survey in Britain, and planning appeal consistency, as well as environmental law in New Zealand. Professor Home holds a PhD from the London School of Economics and Geography, a Master's of Arts in History from Cambridge University, and is a member of the Royal Town Planning Institute. It is wonderful to have you here with us, Professor Home. And so I will, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Home to the World Sustainability Conference.
Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. I don't know how many of you are out there, but it seems to be plenty. And let's get on with the show. I'm going to talk about land. I've listened to the other presentations, and by comparison, what I'm talking about is very basic, because land is everything. I think everybody watching this, unless they're in space or on their private yacht somewhere, is sitting either at home or at their place of work, and it all requires land. And as we run out of resources of all kinds, there's not enough land for all the land uses that need it. You just need to think about nature, forests, food production, mining, and urban development, housing. They all need land. And the global growth of population has been incredible in my lifetime. If you just take the last 40, 50 years, the population of just Africa has gone up 4 to 5 times, placing an enormous strain on the basic resource of land. And at the moment, about 90% of the population of Africa is occupying 20% of the land. That means a lot of pressure on urbanization and some very high densities, even though Africa as a continent is huge. And this is why SDG 11 was created, Sustainable Cities. And indeed, UN Habitat has claimed that SDG 11 is the key SDG, because if you cannot maintain your population in the cities, there's not much future. And of course, the latest crisis, one of many crises, is climate change, reflected in SDG 13. And again, you keep coming back to the basic resource of land. Just a quick mention of one of the leading thinkers in this area, Hernando de Soto from Peru. And he said that in his book, The Mystery of Capital, it's been around for over 20 years now, that the key is a land title. If you give people access to land and you can guarantee their land for them, then they can do great things. They can raise money, they have basic security. Next slide, please. And right now, these current 2 months, there's various events globally, COP27 in Egypt, obviously, which is taking place at this minute, and it includes a round table meeting of urban ministers. And a couple of days ago was World Town Planning Day, linked with World Cities Day, hosted by Shanghai, with the current theme, Act Local to Go Global. So my presentation is very much local, but relevant to everything. And a few days ago, UN Habitat had an urban law day attended by many specialists from around the world. And the main activities was to launch the Law and Climate Change Toolkit through the UN Environment Programme. And if you just Google that, you can find out a lot more. It's about how law, and particularly urban law, which includes planning, can contribute to dealing with climate change. Next slide, please. And urban growth has become uncontrolled in many parts of the world. And the main growth is taking place in peri-urban areas outside of the main settlement boundaries. It's an intermediate area between urban and rural. The institutional frameworks are weak and fragmented. The land uses are mixed up. Land has to provide opportunities for multiple livelihoods. If you come to the city as a poor immigrant, you have to get a living and you may have to do several jobs. The land holdings are typically fragmented. The social structure is fragmented, and these are places of rapid change and places of risk and opportunity. Next slide, please. This is an example. It doesn't particularly matter where it is. It happens to be in Botswana. And on the right-hand side of the slide, there you see the planned development with a road hierarchy and individual housing plots. And on the left hand of the slide, across the green line, which is a railway connection, is an basically unplanned area that grew from a small settlement into something much bigger. And this is a very common pattern you see all over the developed world, sorry, the underdeveloped world, and particularly in Africa. Next slide, please. And one of the problems that has arisen in the last couple of decades particularly is people being evicted from the land. There's a long history of this. The colonial masters, let's call them that, treated the population as they wished, and they could destroy a settlement because they wanted a golf course or something like that. And evictions have gained momentum as the population has increased. So on the left, you've got people complaining in Nigeria about being forced off their land and the money they have to pay out for basic utilities. And on the right, you just got simple message: don't force me out of my house. Next slide, please. And the causes of eviction from land are many. Natural disasters, climate change, earthquakes, tsunamis, drought and famine, all of these are forcing people from their land to migrate across sea to other countries. And this is a huge global problem, which we experience very much in the UK. There can be political reasons: wars, civil conflicts of one sort or another, enemy occupation, dividing up of countries. Think of the partition of India, for example, and exchange of populations, but particularly expropriation of land by governments for what might be good projects, urban renewal projects, development projects of one kind or another. But there's always a negative side effect of forcing people away from their land. Expropriation of land for environmental protection. Wildlife parks, for example. There were people living there and they're forced out. Land can be expropriated for foreign investors, particularly in food production, and then land can be expropriated simply for slum clearance to make a more organized town. Next slide, please. This is an example of land recovery after a natural disaster of an earthquake, this particular one in Kashmir in 2005. And the government there, back one slide, yes, the government there had quite a creative approach to the thousands of people who had physically lost their land because it slipped down the mountainside and wasn't there any longer. And the government had quite a clever scheme to find them a new piece of land, register their title, and simultaneously give them a bank account and give them their first grant of money from the government so that they could make a new start. And here okay, let's continue. Another example is where somebody had occupied land that wasn't his, and the government decided, you've broken the planning laws and we will demolish what you've built. And what he had built, self-built, was quite a nice bungalow. You can see the fence in front. His is the plot behind. And you can't see it clearly on the slide, but there's a big red cross marked on the wall that this house is proposed for demolition. To remove people's access to their own home, quite a nice house in this case, for them is a personal disaster. And the possible remedies for getting their land back or getting an alternative land are difficult, time-consuming, and involve a lot of legal proceedings. Next, this slide is to show the difference between the planned layout, which is the blue outlines, which the government proposed, and what people had already done in advance of the planned scheme, and that's in the purple lines. This is also Botswana, where the government wanted to lay out 20,000 new plots. The surveyors did it all on a map in the office, and when they went down there, they found that people were already there. And the problem was, what do you do? Can you actually evict them? In this particular case, it was virtually politically impossible. Next slide, please. And this is an example of a self-built landlord. If you see, he's standing on a circular plinth. That's where he started with his Rondavelle round hut on a plot which he they allocated to himself. It wasn't issued by the government, but it followed the government recommended plot size, which was quite large, 30 meters by 30 meters. And as soon as he got on it, where he's standing is where he lived at first. And then over the years, with concrete blocks and modern materials, he built simple structures and became a landlord. And you've got his family on one side of the picture. So they live where the camera is. And behind are the various rental accommodations. And now I'd just like to say a few words about the initiatives that have been going on over access to land. And this has been around for, let's say, 30 years. UN Habitat was specifically concerned with human settlements. And since 2006, they have launched a global land tools network. Again, if you want to learn more about it, you can Google very easily that. And they have partners all over working on different techniques for better organizing land, which includes, of course, planning. And then in 2016, the new urban agenda was launched. And again, it's very easy to find that, and it's a fairly short 60, 70-page document, which sets out some very useful guidelines. A particular technique for organizing land is participatory land readjustment. And this has been one of the more successful initiatives of the Global Land Tools Network. And one reason why it's successful is that it's very easy to get new technology on the ground, geospatial technology, so that you can measure the boundaries of the plots and you can reorganize the land and you can get people to participate at the local level. And if you're interested in that, In the brackets, you've got geotech for tenure, which is the use of geospatial technology and community participation to guarantee, hopefully, the land rights of people who are in occupation. Next slide, please. And actually, I'm coming to the end, and I realize that we're falling behind time anyway. But back to the idea of thinking global but act local. Access to land is essentially a local activity. It should be fairly obvious. And therefore, national policy can be important. But what really matters is what happens on the ground and the relationships between society and their local authorities. And there's been interesting developments in this. And if you wanted to attach it to an SDG, SDG 17 is about partnerships. And so this slide is all about partnerships, and partnerships at a local or regional level. There is a World Assembly of Cities and Local Authorities to increase the role and influence of local government and reform the legal structures for the powers and functions. Urban law is the umbrella word for this. And of course, everywhere there's competing needs, but limited resources and capacities, and also very limited awareness of SDGs, as we've heard from previous speakers. And acting local means having democratic governance where the citizens can participate, and if they are organized into community-based organizations, they can negotiate with their governments to secure their access to land. So you have to set up processes and institutions that can allow this. Back to Hernando de Soto, and saying that if you give people some kind of certificate that says they will not be evicted from their land, then they can start to invest where they live and how they earn their livings. And the other key element in achieving democratic governance is, of course, communication. And we've already heard from Professor Walsh on the importance of education. And there has to be revenue. And particularly in Africa, local revenues for local authorities are poor. And there are initiatives in using land as the main mechanism for raising money for public projects. Because, of course, land isn't moving. And if it doesn't move, then you can tax it, or you can tax the owner or occupier of the land. And this is the means to generate income to the local authority for infrastructure, particularly for roads and physical communications, to get this locally on the ground rather than having to use international funding for large projects. And that's my basic presentation, which I think is perhaps rather different from the other speakers because it starts from the land up and how you manage what people want to do, especially in this era of extreme climate change happening right now and the pressures of population. So Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Holm. The question we have from the audience is, in many countries in Africa, using Nigeria as a case study, we have people building in areas that have environmental challenges. Does UN regulate for each nation on land use hats, or each member country is to establish suitable hats?
The second part is that it's for each national government to set up its own land use rules. The UN can offer guidelines, but that's all they are, guidelines, because the sovereignty of the state is protected in international law. So each member country has to tackle it itself. In a continent like Africa, you've got a huge range of population sizes, and some of the smaller countries have very weak resources. Even one of the biggest countries like Nigeria actually has quite weak resources for managing its land use. On the first part, people building in environmental areas that have environmental challenges. That's happening everywhere. People have to live, and so they go and cut down firewood, and so deforestation happens. There's not enough alternatives, there's not enough use. There's sunshine, but there's not enough use of local solar power. And somehow you have to concentrate the population within urban areas. And UN Habitat has a list of target populations, population per square kilometer, to use land economically. And one way of giving people access to nature within densely populated urban areas is through green spaces, which can be protected and then can be used for multiple possibilities. Asian cities have been developing small green spaces in their big cities for decades, and that's a possibility. Another question from Ivan, who's asked questions already.
Says, under what conditions does greater land tenure security lead to more sufficient, equitable, and sustainable resource use?
Well, if poor people are being kicked off whatever land they have because it's not legal, they've got to go somewhere. So basic land security, and you realize you can stay where you are, then you can invest in your own, developing your own building and developing your opportunities. And that's the basic problem. How do you balance the planning needs of a city with its poorest people, who are always the ones who suffer the most? And you've got in Nigeria, Lagos metropolitan area, classic example, and Abuja, Federal Capital Territory. In both of those cases, the government wants to create new modern cities, perhaps redeveloping coastal waterfront schemes, and then people lose out, and they're not even offered a possibility of some alternative place. And the UN has guidelines on all of this, compensation and finding an alternative place to live, but on the ground, this is not what happens. And there's another question.
Yeah, thank you. So there's a slide on the Pakistan land grant. So the question is it mandatory for government to financially support the evictions?
The example I showed from Pakistan from the earthquake, it wasn't, the eviction took place from the earthquake. So they were homeless, living in tents. And what was a very positive approach by the Pakistan Earthquake Recovery Agency, ERRA, was what I showed in the slide, where it made an alternative piece of land available, and it offered them a bank account, a grant, and a certificate of title, all in the same single operation. That's unusual.
Thank you very much, Professor Holm. We enjoyed having you here today.
I like the last comment. I feel speak. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here today. And we look forward to collaboration with you at the Brain Institute.
That would be good.
So thank you so much and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.